Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Two World Podcast. I'm one of your co hosts, Jacob. I have with me today my other co host, who is.
I am Barney.
And Barney and I periodically do a segment where we explore biblical languages. We'll sometimes do that around a certain holiday, or if a certain idea comes up in the church calendar, we might highlight that in our podcast with an episode. But today we have a unique topic. Barney emailed me about a word, and I'm going to hand it over to Barney just to say a little bit more about his email.
Yeah, this story has a little bit of background in one of our previous episodes from maybe June or July, where we were talking about resources available for looking into the Bible a little bit deeper. And then after that episode, my dad sent me a note, and he mentioned how in his men's group, maybe, or a Sunday school group, they had studied the book Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. And and then he said it really fit with what we were talking about, and was really interesting. So I got it out and was reading through it, and it really is interesting to hear about some of the words from the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, and how maybe people in that culture would have been reacting at that time, or how things you could interpret that's different stories from the Bible through that lens. And as I was reading along, one of the topics that they were discussing in the Beatitudes was the idea of righteousness. And then the author makes a note that in one of the dictionaries, one of the resources he used to look at this term righteousness, the word, the Hebrew and the Greek word, what spanned 51 pages in order to fully or adequately or potentially adequately define these terms. And I thought, I couldn't even think of a word that we have in English that would, or a concept or a term that would require 51 pages to um, uh, to fully define its depth, really intense meaning, in-depth meaning. And then that made me think, I wonder what, just out of curiosity, I knew what the word was in that Shiraishi Sensei uses at the Achio Bible Baptist Church. Probably the general term in Japanese for righteousness. But I wondered what would happen if I took just righteousness and put it into Google Translate, and what would Google say? And it wasn't. It was interesting because it didn't end up being the term that we use in church. And then I just kind of went off of that from the different kanjis that came about, and from the initial definition, and then from what the actual definition, which is or the actual word, which is Masayoshi. And then I sent that little blurb to Jacob in an email. Then Jacob came back with a really interesting just kind of analysis on the Hebrew and the Greek words. And then from there, we decided this could be a really interesting topic, because just from the very beginning, how would you think that it would take 51 pages to describe, to fully define this term? And that righteousness, and probably some other terms that come to mind that we come across in the Bible, probably when you sit down and think about it, yeah, they really could expand upon 51 or more words in order, or pages, in order to really fully get to the the full depth of the meaning of those terms.
That's so interesting, Barney. And it was fascinating to see some of the examples that you gave of the term used in Japanese. I think you had some like daily occurrences and usage of the concept. And it's just kind of fascinating to relate those to the Bible. And so, what I wanted to do was to look backward into the Hebrew and Greek context, and then try to move forward from that into more modern expressions in Japanese and English. So,
Mm.
if that sounds all right to you.
Oh yeah.
So, for our listeners, there is one major term, and this resource that Barney is talking about, that he mentioned earlier, that has a very long article, is called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, which is one of those really big resources. If you're going to do a word study on a Greek term, it's super helpful to consult that one if you want to understand a certain concept in the New Testament. But it also, because it's so comprehensive, will go into Hebrew terms that relate to New Testament Greek terms as well. So this is one of those articles and cases where it does that. But anyway, the Hebrew word is called tzedakah. And it's so interesting. When we think of righteousness, we might not have the Hebrew concept in mind.
Mm.
But I want to take some time with it because it has some rich meaning. So this Hebrew concept emerges from Israelites' society, their concept of law and covenant. And ancient Israel was this agrarian society with a strong emphasis on justice and fairness and the right ordering of society. And these concepts are intrinsically linked with God's character and with his righteous dealings with his people. And all of that is described by this term tzedakah. So there's this legal and judicial sense of righteousness in tzedakah and how God has related to his people and how he instructs them to relate to each other. That flows into their personal righteousness, their inner moral purity or integrity, and how they live their lives, but also the social righteousness that they have, how they interact with their neighbors and look after their neighbors, the kindness and compassion that they would have for one another, and also including their care for the vulnerable in society, like widows and orphans and the poor. That's all tied in with this Israelite concept of tzedakah, which once again goes back to their sense of covenant with God and God's character, God's own righteousness. And what kind of comes out of this is this really interesting sense of uh, a world that is ordered rightly under God's design, this cosmic righteousness. And this word righteousness, tzedakah, in Hebrew often appears in the Old Testament alongside another word, mishpat, which means justice. And the idea
Mm.
that when justice and righteousness are together manifested in society, that there's this kind of cosmic order or harmony or shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, that they're intertwined. And so maybe you're getting a sense that there's a lot more of a corporate kind of social dimension to righteousness in the Old Testament. And when we say righteousness in the New Testament, we're often not thinking about that social context. Most of the time, we're thinking of more of a personal context. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a background of why I think that is. And then maybe we could ask the question, have we
Mm.
lost something by not having a more robust sense of the social dimension of righteousness? So anyway, in the New Testament, the word for righteousness is dikaiosune. And that word has a lot of the connotations of righteousness from the Old Testament that we just talked about, but it has a few other distinct, um, unique aspects. So, on the one hand, since it's a Greek term, people might think about the Greek philosophers, and there's maybe a limited sense in which any of their works impacted the New Testament, but in the Greek mind, and in their philosophical writings, this concept of righteousness was an inner characteristic that almost had the quality of virtue. So, like honesty and integrity and compassion were in the Greek philosophers' minds expressions of this dikaiosune, this Greek concept of righteousness. But in the New Testament, through the work of Jesus and the message of the gospel, we have this salvific sense of righteousness, where dikaiosune has this distinct Christian meaning. We're referring to the righteousness that Jesus gives to the believers as they have faith in him and through what he has done through his grace provided by the cross and what he did on the cross, and through his resurrection. He makes this grace available to people, and that becomes for them their righteousness. What they couldn't achieve on their own is given to them as a free gift. And so, because of that, it takes on this very personal spiritual quality. The righteousness given to each one of us by Jesus through faith. Um, and as we focus on it, that's a very powerful meaning for the term. But so in certain conversations, like in the church today, you might almost have a pitting against the New Testament concept of this personal sense of righteousness with the Old Testament concept of a social sense of righteousness and responsibility. And so what you have sometimes, and this is obviously a broad brushstroke conversation, but in certain parts of the evangelical world, that a lot of people would be comfortable talking about personal righteousness through faith in Christ, but they wouldn't be comfortable talking about social justice But then you have in other parts of the Christian world, like more progressive elements in mainline denominations, who are very happy talking about social justice and social dimensions of righteousness, but maybe don't talk much about personal conversion. But if you look at both terms side by side and reading the Bible and as a whole, you see that both are integral and important. So how do we balance a personal sense of the um, the, the integrity, the transforming work, the change in us that God calls us to and wants to help us achieve, and the compassion that God produces in us, and then relate that to our relationship with our neighbors and our communities in the broader world. And both have to be there. And so I just wanted to take a little time just to pause and say, Barney, had you been heard that before or been aware of some of these distinctions? Just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this was all really new to me when we started discussing this, and I was really interested in so many different aspects and ways that the word was used in Hebrew. And then when you mentioned like kind of the root of it, especially how God is viewed by the Israelites in the Old Testament, then it really makes sense how it perfectly meshes with their view of God, and so neat to see how they wanted to integrate that of what it means of this aspect of being godly, of being like God, into as many different parts of their um, lives and society as they could. And then hearing you talk more, I kind of wondered, I wonder how that we would really describe these kind of situations in English, because we wouldn't really, I don't think that these phrases, personal and social righteousness and legal and judicial righteousness, they're not phrases that we use so often. And I wonder, I wonder what we would say in a normal conversation otherwise. And then the other thought that came to my mind, and I don't know, this might be something that we have to look at later, but um, in the Septuagint, is that right? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. I wonder if they would use a different word for righteousness as it's used in the Greek or in the Old Testament as what they're using in the New Testament, or if they would continue to use that same word.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Barney, because um, the theological dictionary of the New Testament includes the um, material from the Septuagint. And one thing that often happens, and you might have heard this before, is that many of the passages in the New Testament that quote Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament passages are doing so from the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the language the Septuagint use has kind of been picked up or received in the New Testament already. I mean, they're both in Greek. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was easy for the writers of the New Testament to use this Greek translation because it was so widely used, and it was very widespread and available and popular with Greek speaking
Mm-hmm.
Jews. And so it was a natural place to go. Some of the passages seem to be translated maybe out of the Hebrew into Greek on the fly by the whoever's quoting it, in
Uh-huh.
the New Testament. So I think there are some examples, but I think most, the majority of examples have been drawn from the Septuagint. So they have picked up the term
Oh
dikaiosune
wow.
from the
Mm-hmm.
Septuagint, and so and in that sense, you would get, if you were reading the term in the Septuagint, you would get those similar associations
Mm-hmm.
that the tzedakah word in Hebrew in the Old Testament of you know righteousness as connected with God's covenant with His people and His expectations for how they treat one another, and in their relationship with Him, and His expectations for their own personal righteousness, and all of those things were tied up in with the Septuagint as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those concepts are received into the New Testament, but
Right.
then in addition to that, you have this new dimension when the ministry of Jesus is added to what was talked about in the history of Israel. Then you get to the point where Jesus brings this whole other part of the meaning to righteousness when it's related to His work and the grace He offers. And so, yeah, that's something that Paul and a lot of the other New Testament writers really unpack even after the ministry of Jesus, after he's ascended. They have all these additional thoughts of the meaning. But yeah,
Mm,
that's a really good question. But
mhm,
the other thing that's fascinating is your first question is how much do we talk this way in
mhm,
daily life? And I would argue, I think in a lot of ways, our discourse is much more has become like secularized
mhm.
and common media and discourse like around. If we use terms like righteousness, it would probably be um, like quoting or talking about
Mm,
something that happened with a religious community or a teacher. But most of the time,
mhm.
I think people when they're talking about these things have more like, I mean, of a generic, almost like the Greek mindset of virtue or
Right.
good qualities. So if they,
Hmm.
news stories about somebody who was a good person or helped others or was
Right.
sacrificial or, did something that stood out for being good for the community. And there'll be stories about that. Or we can talk about values in our nation that, help the middle class or help people
Hmm.
who are
Hmm. Hmm.
impoverished or struggling, like social programs or
Right.
other things that are kind of getting at
Right.
the the concepts from the Old Testament or New Testament, but don't use this specific language. So yeah, I think largely we've taken that term out of usage for most daily things. But I don't know. How about for the context in Japan? Do you hear any uses of the term that you had mentioned, Pastor Kimiaki talking about in sermons? The term righteousness, is it appearing in daily life in any way?
Yeah, I agree that probably it's treated similarly as it would be in American English, where it really probably is just reserved probably for church services. The first word that I mentioned, the one that Google came up with, which was jizen, which they more translate as charity or philanthropy, like being charitable. That would be more likely to come up, I would think. Um, but then, so usually when at the church when we have high school students that are visiting, or maybe someone who is just a visitor in general at church, then sometimes during the service when Kimiaki, since he's speaking, then he kind of has to pause a bit and like add some context to these terms, like if he uses masayoshi or for righteousness, or if he uses sumi for sin, as that word is so often thought of as crime, and that is used in an everyday context, but as crime, um, not as sin, and so that really requires a lot of extra context explanation during the message. But then to kind of get back on the points you were making, I wonder if either intentional or unintentional limiting of how we use righteousness, if it kind of gives it a little bit more power, um, uh, uh, kind of making it feel a little bit more sacred in a way as a word. Um, because it would sound really kind of out of context if we started to try to use the word more and more in our daily conversations. It might seem a little self-righteous, but I wonder. On the other hand, I kind of like the idea of how widely it's used in Hebrew, as it keeps us mindful of that relationship that with God, and this word really being representative of qualities of God. I like that, having that kind of continually in the forefront of your mind. And it seems like that's also kind of a um, concept that was common in other ways in the Israelite life that we read in the Old Testament. Like, I think, is it right that people would begin their day with a few verses from Deuteronomy, right? The Lord thy God is, I can't remember from what part, if I think it's the text
Yeah,
that
the
they
Shema.
Shema, that's right.
The Lord our God, the Lord
Uh-huh.
is one.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
and then the other part of that is, yeah, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and
Hmm.
with all your mind and with all your strength. Um, and then in the New Testament, and also drawing from another Old Testament passage, it highlights the second part of, and you also love your neighbors yourself. So,
Mm, hmm.
there you go in terms of balancing the idea of personal righteousness and your connection with God, and then social
Right.
righteousness and your
Right.
connection with your neighbor, like in such a core affirmation. Like Jesus
Mm.
affirmed those as the greatest commandments, and
Oh yeah.
they were yeah, like you said, at the core of everyday spirituality for um, Israelites back then. Is that the Shema has continued to be used up until
Mhm.
our present time in the Jewish community. So
Oh yeah.
it's very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so so yeah, that's a good point. I'm sure that if I heard you right, that the term righteousness can have some legal associations with crime, like maybe a language around people being charged with a crime or something in the Japanese context. I'm sure in our legal system in the U.S. There are vestiges of biblical languages for sure, because a lot of um, yeah, legal language, like just from our history, was informed by um, what's often called like the Judeo-Christian values, or like the biblical tradition, or um, so yeah. And I wonder, like, if this idea shaped um, the worldview of Israelites, and then into the New Testament, the worldview of early Christians, and then like we don't use the term as such in English today, but we still, even if for a non-religious person, I think these concepts of how we treat our neighbor and how we live with integrity or not, they're still present in some form. So I guess my question is, like, I mean, how do we talk about them, or should we talk
Mm.
about these concepts of
Mm.
justice, personal, pardon me, of righteousness, like personal dimension or social dimension or the spiritual dimension, uh, in our relationship with God? Do you have any thoughts or suggestion?
Yeah, that's so neat how it's kind of always in the background. That how a lot of people how we as humans are just intrinsically striving to do these notions, to live the way that God would want us to live, whether or not that is how we're practicing, intentionally practicing. And I think that's why what you mentioned earlier, how virtue is probably a word that is so highly regarded. We would really say, oh wow, that person is very virtuous, or wow, they really have a lot of virtue, that person does, more so than, and it seems to be something a little bit more tangible when I think it over, as compared to saying, oh, that person is so righteous. It seems so unattainable to call someone intentionally that. Um, and and you're right. We see all types of people, especially now with having access to people sharing videos online or sharing stories online, and we get through. We get past. We don't necessarily concern ourselves with if that person's going to church, or what kind of, how, if they're religious or whatnot, but we see their acts and what they're doing as being virtuous, being righteous is what they're doing. And but no one is expressly these days goes out of their way to say, wow, you're living such a godly life, you're being such an upstanding Christian, in the way you're doing. We affirm the people that are doing these great acts, but we would be more likely to say, wow, that's so, honorable, admirable of you, so um, commendable. But through all of these words, kind of in the background, is this idea of the social righteousness that's been with us. And it's great and reassuring to see that kind of people's um, instinct and intuition is to strive for helping out people that we don't really have, I maybe as our neighbors that we have a bigger connection with, or just as our fellow human being that we don't have so much connection with, but we have that impulse to help others, and it's neat that that in the undertone, the undercurrent to that is this idea of righteousness.
As you were talking there, Barney, I was thinking about how the word could be translated in a way that would speak to modern readers, take into consideration what you were saying with our greater appreciation of a sense of like a more non-religious like virtue.
Mm.
And so I thought, oh, like what? How could you translate this term and have it communicate? And so I looked up Eugene Peterson's.
Ah,
He paraphrased the
ah,
Message, and
uh-huh,
I just picked a random verse.
uh-huh,
I don't know if you're familiar with the one in Matthew 5:20 where Jesus is teaching his followers, and he says, "Unless your righteousness
uh-huh.
exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees," and he's trying to talk about like outward displays of piety and
Yeah.
how they're actually not truly expressions of righteousness as much as a more inner like authentic like love and revering
Mm.
of God and of help compassion towards neighbor, but anyway, this is how Eugene Peterson expresses
Okay.
it. Instead of saying unless your righteousness exceeds, this is what he said: unless you do far better than the Pharisees in the matters of right living, you won't know the
Ah.
first thing about entering the kingdom of heaven. And so I thought that's kind of fascinating. Unless if you do better, unless if you do
Mm.
far better than the Pharisees in the
Mm-hmm.
matters of right living. So
Right
right
living.
living,
Mm.
it's interesting. I mean, that gets us closer
Mm-hmm.
to a contemporary way of doing better at right living. But I think even the term right, like calling something right or wrong, people might be
Mm.
like, well, why would you say right living?
I,
What, like
who
it's
who
almost like
is to say? Yeah.
there's probably even a more nuanced way of saying it, but maybe compassionate living or um,
Mm.
living that is like um, benefits others. I don't know, but anyway, there's one attempt, and I think in general he is very creative, Eugene Peterson,
Oh yeah.
at finding good language to represent things. So, um, yeah, and so you would say in the Japanese context as well,
Mm.
if people talk about like living kindly towards your neighbor or having compassion, like you talked about, Google said charity,
Mm-hmm.
works of
Mm-hmm.
charity, are an expression of this concept. Is there anything else in Japanese context that you would think would connect with this idea of like how do we translate this idea from the biblical sense of righteousness into modern life?
Yeah, that is tricky because in general, um like it pe- people come in, people always use kind of a circuitous way, a kind of roundabout way to I don't like compliment someone for something outstanding that they've done. There's always a notion of humility and of not wanting to kind of put yourself above others so much. Not necessarily standing out, but you um you want everyone to feel like everyone's great. Not that I'm so much greater than you, or I did something so much better, or that what I did you wouldn't have done, had you had the same chance. And so I don't really think of some kind of context where, I mean, people would, if it's, of course, if it's something online, they would use very casual language and say, wow, that was great, wow, amazing, wow, that's what a fine person. Um, but like if it's something that we're just discussing, like in a group amongst various parents, that kind at school, that kind of connection where our connection is that our kids go to the same school, then someone would probably say, wow, that was amazing, but then the parents would would say, "Oh no, it was nothing. We didn't do anything that our kids didn't do anything that no one else would have done. Our kids were just being normal kids. They were just doing what anyone else would do. And so in that sense, I think that's probably why I was mentioning how like a term like Masayoshi or even Chizen isn't so commonly used. I think people are feeling those those ideas, but expressing them through words is much less frequent. Um, and so it would be, I think that people just like kind of it's a real high context that people notice it but don't necessarily comment on it. Um, that, the more that I think about this, it's interesting in that way.
It is interesting, and I'm kind of wondering as I'm listening to you talk about that, if the social sense of righteousness in the Old Testament isn't maybe more akin to or appealing to maybe
Mhm.
a more of a collectivist sense in Japanese society of social harmony, because we talked about like in the Hebrew mind when justice and righteousness are in balance in a society and people treat each other well, that there's this shalom, there's this well-being, there's this harmony.
Yeah, I think that must be when you point that out, it really makes sense because I think that really is such an important part of Japanese society that I think, yeah, I can really see that um, this communal righteousness, this social righteousness is really at the forefront of how societies and communities are society and different all of these communities and big or small are working in various contexts, school and work and neighborhood are, I think that really is the forefront, the one of the most important things, and it's neat to see how much that's emphasized.
And I know it's interesting because like we talked about in the New Testament in the Greek concept of dikaiosune, with personal righteousness, like this connection with Jesus that is has this personal transformation in an individual's life. How that would be so appealing in more of an individualistic culture,
Mhm, mhm,
but it doesn't mean, and maybe that's why you see like in American evangelicalism partly such an emphasis on that. Maybe sometimes, in extreme cases, maybe even to the exclusion of other emphases of the concept of righteousness, like we said, social or otherwise. But anyway, it's fascinating because both senses are needed, and an individualistic experience of righteousness is relevant to life just as a social commitment to helping one another and having righteousness and that kind of. So, and the other thing I probably want to say is I'm probably aware in the Japanese context that there are many factors that have shaped um, like and informed the sense of interconnectedness and like I'm sure there are like longstanding like religious and philosophical reasons why Japanese society has those values as it does like
mhm.
Confucianism and Buddhism and otherwise. But like it's just kind of interesting to think about a dialogue where you bring into that kind of cultural set of values like this Old Testament concept and see
Mhm.
like what kind of connections you can make, and that kind of could appeal to maybe to some in a way. I don't know. I just think that's fascinating. But do you think that the individualistic concept of righteousness, in your experience, like in the church in Japan, does that have traction too? Like, is that resonating with people as well? The individualistic sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when we talk about it in church or learn or hear about it, learn about it, that yeah, I think that it really does resonate. I think especially with the background that we're getting by studying the Bible and probably on kind of unearthing or like reviving this word that I don't know. I'll have to ask my wife tomorrow, what does Masayoshi mean to you? And I wonder if she'll quickly give an answer or think about it or say, where did you get that word? I'm curious that um, um, if if it really is kind of hearing it in church, giving it context in the Bible, if it really kind of brings it to life, I think, for us when we in the congregation and of course teachers of the word. Um, and yeah, it's kind of neat to have these words or concepts or ideas that normally aren't used or aren't used in the way, and then seeing them in a new way and getting a deeper understanding for the words themselves, and then seeing how they were important in the Bible, and then seeing how they're important for us too. I think kind of like when we were talking all the way back with naming our kids, how I said that I wanted to use the kanji for compassion, but how the everyday person doesn't kind of the same idea, kind of sees it as someone's compassionate is kind of putting themselves a little bit higher than others because admitting that there are people who need compassion. Um,
Mm,
right. And so, but when you
yes.
see it in how it's used in the Bible, then you think, wow, what a virtuous, what a righteous word that is. What a great concept it is of compassion. And yeah, it's like these words have two facets, at least, multifaceted, and like two lives, the secular life and the religious life. And it's neat to be able to see them in both contexts and get a great appreciation for them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Barney. And I don't know quite how to frame this question, but I feel like what is a positive in one context, like you talk about secular and religious, like can be seen as a negative in the other. And what I mean
Hmm.
by that is like when I'll just take the Christian community, for example, or a Christian um, mindset or something. Like when the term righteousness is used in those conversations, often it might be this positive thing that we're seeking after. And but when a non-religious person hears us talking about that, they might think, "Oh, those Christians are talking about stuff that they're going to judge me about because I don't measure up to their concept of what that is, or they assume I don't have that, or whatever." And so I guess there's just a lot of complexity when you talk about
Mm.
these terms and you talk about the religious and the secular context, like religious language that we, when I say we, I mean those who are part of religious community or the Christian community, like can relate to and like hear regularly on a Sunday morning, or
Mm.
when we're reading our Bible, that see in different passages, like have sometimes these words have become loaded in secular
Mm.
context, and people have, because maybe verses have been quoted at people, or people who have been felt to have been judged or condemned by religious people. Then I don't know. I guess that's why what Eugene Peterson was trying to do in that passage I read earlier, trying to find a way to build a bridge and use language that would be meaningful to somebody who's not
Mm.
religious, to try
Mm.
to convey that the truth that behind maybe how Christians have failed or misused the term or have been judgmental or whatever, but they maybe failed to communicate that really God wants every person to have a life that is filled with transformation and goodness, and how they live, and how they interact with other human beings. So it's not
Mm.
meant to be like this exclusionary thing only for um, this one subset, but it's God's intent for all of humanity. And so I don't know. I think in that way, we kind of probably need to be more creative when we're thinking about, and outside of the religious context, how we work at these ideas or talk about them, to be more mindful of building on the common ground and reaching out to people to say, like, we care about how we treat our neighbors. We're
Mm.
not trying to be judgmental towards people who don't have this religious background. We believe God, is there to help humans flourish and get along well with each other, and love one another better. Like the greatest commands we said earlier, love your neighbor and love God, or in the
Mm.
order, love God and love your neighbor. Like that's the core. So how often we failed to convey that sometimes with some of the language that's used that comes off as just purely judgmental or exclusionary. Anyway, just thinking about that a little bit. Do you have any other thoughts or any other questions before we would close today?
Yeah, I was just thinking kind of as two thoughts for closing from my end. The one was as I thought about the Hebrew word and the Greek word and how the Greek word adds kind of some more meaning or a different way of looking at the term. It made me think of when Jesus said that he did not come to take away or change, what was written before, but we see that this idea of righteousness, and then he just added to it. And it's what the part that he did add to is just so great and makes it so much a more robust word and idea and concept. And to that matter, especially thinking of what you just spoken about, I can understand now why it takes 51 pages to define these terms. And I think that maybe all of us need to take some time thinking about that, especially before we use words. Especially these words that understanding that maybe um, they could be real powerful, especially as maybe some of them are more limited in the way that we use them, and we need to think carefully about how we use these terms and think about what they do mean so that we can use them really in the right way, I think. And this is such a great topic, so much fun to how this idea started and how it came about, and then getting to discuss it with you today. And I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much, Barney. I feel the same way. I'm thrilled that you have this vast knowledge of the context in Japan so that we can compare these words with Japanese words. And it's always fun just to go deep to and reflect with you on these biblical concepts because I know you have been reading the Bible for many years and love languages. And so it's so fun for both of us, I think, to
Mhm.
just dive deep into this information. So thank you for taking this time.
Mhm. Yeah, and we'd like to thank all of our listeners for joining us today and listening along with us up to this point. And we hope that it was engaging and interesting and gives you a lot to think about. And we would like to say that this was our 99th episode. And as it's being filmed separately, me back in Japan and Jacob in Ohio. But for 100, episode 100 coming up very soon, we have a special episode that we were able to record together when I was in Ohio this just a few weeks ago. So we hope that you are looking forward to that one as very much as we are to presenting it to you in the coming days and weeks. And so for the Two World Podcast with Jacob, I am Barney, and we thank you as always, and we'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.